3 days after my wife's funeral, my son asked me to sign away the house. I read the last page first. That single habit, something I picked up decades ago, negotiating contracts on factory floors, is the only reason I am alive to tell you this story at all. When I was 57, my only son emptied my house, packed up his wife, and drove 2 states away, leaving me exactly $150 and a note on the kitchen counter that read, "You will figure it out." 15 years later, my grandson typed my name into a search engine for a college assignment and called me sobbing so hard he could barely speak. Within 12 hours, my phone had logged 200 missed calls from the son, who threw me out like a bag of trash. Before I tell you exactly how I answered those calls, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had to stand up to family who mistook your quiet for weakness. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is for you. My phone lit up the darkness of my study like a struck match, buzzing itself across the surface of my desk in short, angry bursts. Outside my window, the city stretched out in a grid of gold and silver light, a view I still had not gotten used to after 15 years of building it, one contract at a time from absolutely nothing. I did not reach for it right away. I sat in my chair, hands folded, and watched the little number in the corner of the screen climb past 180, past 190, until it finally settled on 200. 200 missed calls in under 12 hours. Every single one of them from a name I had not said out loud in 15 years. I picked up the phone slowly, the same way you'd pick up something that used to burn you. My hands were rougher now than they had been back then, thick with calluses from years of work. I never expected to be doing at my age, in a life I never expected to be living. I swiped to answer and lifted it to my ear without saying a word. There was ragged breathing on the other end, then a voice, young and shaking. "Grandpa." That word went through me like a current. It was Ethan. The last time I had laid eyes on him, he was 5 years old, running barefoot through my backyard, utterly unaware that the adults inside the house were quietly deciding to erase me from his life. I let the silence sit there for a moment, heavy with everything neither of us knew how to say. "Grandpa, please don't hang up," Ethan begged, his voice cracking apart. I didn't know. I swear on everything I didn't know. I was doing a research project for my business ethics class. We had to profile an entrepreneur who built something from nothing, and I typed your name in just to see if you were even still alive. "Grandpa, there's an article. It says you built an entire water purification company from a rented storage unit. It says you give away almost everything you make to elder abuse charities. Is that you? Is that really you?" I closed my eyes and let out a slow breath, the kind that carries 15 years of weight in it. "Yes, Ethan," I said finally, my voice even. "It's me." He broke down completely on the other end of the line, 22 years old and crying like the child I remembered. "They told me you left us," he said between sobs. "Mom and Dad said you had some kind of breakdown after Grandma died, that you took money that wasn't yours and disappeared. But the article says you were homeless for a while. It says you started with nothing. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I did not raise my voice. I have found over the years that the men who need to shout the loudest are usually the ones with the least actual power. "Your parents made choices, Ethan," I said. "They chose to take what I had left, and they chose to lie to you about it for 15 years. I didn't run from anything. I survived what they did to me." Before he could ask another question, I heard a scuffle on his end, a door thrown open, a gasp, a voice barking, "Give me that." The line went dead for half a second, and then a new voice came through, breathless and performing panic like a man trying to remember his lines. "Dad?" Derek said. "Dad, is that you? We've been trying to find you for 15 years. We've looked everywhere." I said nothing. I let him talk, listening not to his words, but to the shape underneath them, and underneath the fear I heard something colder and much more familiar. Greed dressed up as relief. "Dad, please, my company's in serious trouble," he went on, his voice sliding into a practiced, wounded softness. "We're facing something catastrophic. When Ethan showed us that article, we couldn't believe it was you. You have to tell me where you are. We're family. You have to help us." I pulled the phone away from my ear, looked at his name glowing on the screen, and pressed the red circle with my thumb. The call ended with a small, definitive click, and the study went quiet again. The first move had been his. Every move after that one would be mine. To understand why I hung up on my own son without a flicker of hesitation, you have to go back to a kitchen counter 15 years ago, and further back than that, to a single afternoon 3 days after I buried my wife. Eleanor and I had been married 31 years when the cancer finally took her. I was 57 years old, standing in a cemetery in a suit I hadn't worn since our anniversary, watching them lower the only person who had ever fully known me into the ground. Grief does something to a man that nothing else can. It doesn't just hurt you, it hollows you out and leaves the door open for anyone who wants to walk in. 3 days after the funeral, Derek came by the house with a folder of documents. He told me they were routine, hospital billing forms, life insurance paperwork, a power of attorney just in case, so he could help manage things while I got back on my feet. He set the folder on the kitchen table where Eleanor used to keep her reading glasses, and he slid a pen across to me. I want to tell you I was too smart to fall for it. I want to tell you grief didn't touch me at all. But the truth is simpler and harder. I picked up that folder, and out of a habit built over 30 years of running a small manufacturing outfit, negotiating with suppliers who loved slipping bad terms into the back pages where nobody reads, I flipped straight to the last page first. And there, buried under a paragraph of dense legal language, was a line that made my stomach turn even through the fog of grief. It wasn't a standard power of attorney, it was a full transfer of deed, my house, signed directly over to Derek and Vanessa, effective immediately upon signature. I looked up at my son. What is this? I said, tapping the page. This isn't a hospital form, Derek. This is the deed to the house. For a moment something flickered across his face, something quick and calculating, before he laughed it off. He said the lawyer must have stapled the wrong packet together, some mix-up with another client. He'd get it fixed and bring the real forms back later. He took the folder, apologized, and left. I believed him. God help me, I believed him. Because he was my son and I had just buried the only other person on earth who knew me completely. And I did not yet understand that grief is exactly the kind of weather predators wait for. 4 days later, Derek came back with a different folder, thinner this time, and a doctor's note for something to help me sleep. He said the funeral home paperwork needed my signature too, life insurance beneficiary confirmations, nothing that mattered. I was exhausted in a way I had never been exhausted before, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and refuses to let you think clearly. I did not flip to the last page that time. I signed where he told me to sign, and I went to bed. I woke up 9 days after my wife's funeral to an empty house. Not empty in the way a house feels empty after a death. Empty in the way a house looks after professional movers have stripped it down to the studs. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, Eleanor's reading chair, her rose garden tools still hanging in the shed, gone. My key didn't turn in the front door because the locks had been changed. On the porch, weighted down by a stone, was an envelope with $150 in crumpled bills and a note in my son's handwriting. You will figure it out. They had taken my home, my savings, and my grandson, and driven 2 states away without a single look back, using a signature I had given while half asleep and drowning in grief, on a document I never got the chance to read to the last page. Looking back now, I can see how carefully it was staged. One small theft layered quietly under the next, so that no single loss ever felt large enough to fight. 2 days after the funeral, before the fake paperwork even appeared, Derek had already taken my truck in for what he called routine service and simply never brought it back, telling me he'd lend me Vanessa's old sedan in the meantime. My retriever, Gus, who'd slept at the foot of Eleanor's hospital bed every night of her final month, disappeared the same week, with Vanessa explaining gently that a rescue family up north could give him more attention than we can manage right now. My late father's toolbox, the one Eleanor bought me for our 5th anniversary, vanished from the garage a full week before the movers ever touched the furniture. Each theft on its own looked almost like a kindness, a family helping a grieving old man simplify his life. Stacked together, they were a controlled demolition, and I only understood the shape of it once the whole structure had already come down around me. I sat down on my own front porch steps with $150 in my hand, and I did not cry. I want to tell you I cried, because that would be the human thing to do, but by then something in me had already gone very still and very cold. I remember thinking one clear thought: I will never again sign anything, trust anyone, or make a decision without reading it to the very last word. And I will never let anyone mistake my silence for surrender again. A man named Sal Delgado found me 2 nights later, sleeping in my truck in the parking lot behind his hardware store. He didn't ask questions. He knocked on the window, told me the lot camera had been watching me for 2 nights running, and said if I was going to sleep somewhere, I might as well sleep in the stockroom, where there was a cot and a working furnace. I told him I couldn't pay him. He said he wasn't asking me to. He said, "You look like a man who knows how to work. Sweep the floors in the morning and we'll call it even." Sal became the family I did not know I still had. He gave me a job stacking inventory, then running deliveries, then managing his back office when he realized I understood supply chains better than anyone he'd hired in years. At night, in that stockroom, I started to sketching out an idea I'd been chewing on for years at my old manufacturing job: a cheaper, more efficient filtration system for contaminated well water in small towns that couldn't afford municipal upgrades. Sal lent me $4,000 from his own savings to build the first prototype. It is, to this day, the single largest investment anyone ever made in me, and he never once asked when he'd get it back. I remember one night, maybe 4 months into living above that stockroom, standing at the counter with a cup of Sal's terrible coffee, telling him I didn't understand how a son could do what mine had done. Sal didn't offer me comfort. He wiped down the counter and said, "Some people aren't broken by what happened to them, Walt. They're revealed by it. Your boy didn't turn into somebody new the day he sold your house. He just finally showed you who he'd been the whole time." I have carried that sentence with me for 15 years. It is, in a strange way, the truest thing anyone ever told me about my own family. A month after that conversation, a delivery came to the store addressed to me, no return name on it, just a small cardboard box. Inside were Eleanor's old gardening gloves, worn soft at the fingertips, the ones that used to hang by our shed door. I never learned for certain who sent them, though I have always suspected a neighbor who'd watched the moving trucks come and go and quietly rescued one small thing from a dumpster before it disappeared for good. I kept those gloves in my desk drawer through every single year that followed, through every product failure, every rejected loan application. Every night I wondered if I'd made a catastrophic mistake believing I could build something out of nothing at 57 years old. They were, in their own small way, proof that not everyone in this world takes. Some people, quietly and without asking for credit, still give things back. By year 3, Kessler Water Systems had outgrown Sal's stockroom and moved into a proper warehouse 2 towns over. By year 7, we had contracts in 11 states. By year 12, the company had gone global, and I had quietly begun funneling the majority of what I earned into causes that mattered to me: elder financial protection programs, legal aid clinics, anything that might have saved a version of myself 15 years younger from ever ending up on that porch in the first place. Sal retired from the hardware store the year I hit my first billion in company valuation, and I bought the building outright and turned it into a training center for the foundation's future caseworkers. Some debts, I have learned, are best repaid not with a check, but by making sure the kindness keeps moving forward. 15 years is a long time to build something out of nothing. I will not walk you through every year of it, the failed pitches, the nights I ate crackers for dinner so I could make payroll for my first 2 employees, the year we nearly folded before a small municipal contract in Ohio saved us. I will tell you that the filtration systems worked. I will tell you that word spread, contract by contract, town by town, until Kessler Water Systems was operating in 11 states, then supplying clean water infrastructure to entire regions overseas, and I was no longer the broken man sleeping in a hardware store stockroom. I was, according to a magazine article my grandson found on a Tuesday night doing homework, worth more money than I ever imagined existed, most of it already promised away to causes I cared about. I never remarried. I never had another child. but I never once stopped thinking about the boy who used to run barefoot through my backyard, and I made sure quietly, through channels Derek never knew existed, that I always knew Ethan was safe, even if I could not be the one to keep him that way. Which brings us back to that night in my study, the phone buzzing itself across the desk, 200 missed calls, and the sound of my son's voice asking me to save him from a crisis he had absolutely no idea. I already understood in complete detail. I did not call Derek back that night. Instead, I picked up the phone and dialed a different number. "Marcus," I said when he answered. "It's time to open the file on my son's company." Marcus Webb had been my general counsel for 11 years, ever since Kessler Water Systems grew large enough to need someone who could outlawyer anyone who tried to take advantage of us. He was also the only person besides Sal who knew the complete truth of what happened 15 years ago, because he was the one who had spent 3 months quietly tracking down the original forged deed transfer, the real one, buried in a county records office 2 states away, with my exhausted, half-asleep signature on it. "You've been expecting this call for a while," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question. I've been expecting it since the day I signed a document I never should have trusted," I said. "Pull everything you can on Derek's real estate firm. Something's wrong. A man doesn't make 200 calls in 12 hours to a father he abandoned unless he's drowning." 2 days later, Derek called my office and demanded, through my assistant, an in-person meeting. I agreed, on the condition it happen in my boardroom, on my terms, at my time. When he and Vanessa walked in, I almost didn't recognize the confidence draining out of both of them the moment they sat down across the table from me. Derek didn't waste time with apologies. He slid a thick folder across the glass table exactly the way he'd slid one across my kitchen table 15 years earlier, and for one disorienting second, I felt the ghost of that afternoon pass through the room. This time, though, I was not grieving, and I was not exhausted, and I flipped straight to the last page before he'd even finished his pitch. He wanted $2 million, framed as a loan to cover what he called a temporary liquidity issue in his development firm. He used words like bridge financing and market correction, trying to sound like a man in a boardroom instead of a man in a burning building. Vanessa, seated beside him in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, added her own angle, telling me that Ethan had suffered psychological damage growing up without a grandfather, and that the very least I owed them was a trust fund to make up for my abandonment. I let that word sit in the air. Abandonment, spoken by the woman who had watched her husband forge my signature on a deed transfer while I was drugged with grief and barely able to stand. I let the silence stretch after Vanessa finished speaking. 10 seconds, maybe 15, long enough that I watched Derek's knee start bouncing under the table. I furrowed my brow slightly, let my shoulders drop half an inch, gave them exactly the picture they wanted, a tired old man wrestling privately with guilt. It cost me nothing. It bought me everything, because Derek had never once, in his entire life, had the patience to sit inside someone else's silence without filling it himself. $2 million is a very specific number for a temporary liquidity issue, I said finally, keeping my tone almost gentle. Most bridge loans I've seen come with a range. Yours doesn't. Why is that? Something flickered behind Derek's eyes, there and gone fast enough that I almost missed it. It's just what the accountants came back with, Dad. It's not complicated. Humor me, I said. Walk me through where exactly the shortfall is coming from. Which project? Which investor group? I built a company from a storage unit, Derek. I understand balance sheets better than most people in this city. He hesitated a beat too long, and Vanessa jumped in to cover for him, pivoting smoothly back to Ethan, back to the trust fund, back to the wound they thought would guarantee a check. I did not throw the folder back at them. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked one quiet question, and if I said no, Derek's whole face changed, the polish cracked. He slammed his palm flat on the glass table and told me I was a selfish old man sitting on more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, while my real family struggled. He said I owed them. He said the word owed like it was a debt collector's threat, and in that single sentence I watched the last shred of doubt I had been carrying for 15 years evaporate completely. He believed my silence all those years had been weakness. He was about to learn otherwise. I told them I would give my answer at the Kessler Foundation's annual benefit gala, 2 nights from now, in front of the entire board, the press, and every major investor in the region. I told them to dress well, to bring Ethan, and to be exactly on time. Derek's eyes lit up like a man who had already spent the money in his head. He had no idea he was walking straight into the one room in the city where I held every single card. The following morning, Marcus arrived at my penthouse with a briefcase heavier than usual, and a look on his face I had learned to take very seriously. He spread the documents across my desk without a word of preamble. "Your son isn't dealing with a market downturn," he said. "He's been siphoning funds from his own development projects for 3 years, funneling investor money into a lifestyle he can't remotely afford, and covering the gaps with fabricated vendor invoices. 2 months ago, a group of his investors hired their own forensic accountants. They found a $4 million hole in his books. The FBI has had an open file on him for 6 weeks. Every piece fell into place at once. The 200 calls. The sudden, desperate hunger to reconnect after 15 years of silence. The exact, specific figure of $2 million, which wasn't an investment ask at all. It was hush money, meant to quietly plug a hole before federal agents came through his front door. I sat with that for a long moment, and I will admit, even after everything, some old and stubborn part of me went looking for a reason, some thread of understanding I could hold on to. Marcus told me what his own investigators had pieced together about Derek's early years in the business, how badly he'd wanted to outrun the shadow of a father he saw as cold and endlessly working, how a few early real estate wins had convinced him that fast, borrowed success was the only kind that would ever make him feel like enough. It didn't excuse a single thing he'd done, it never will, but it helped me understand that Derek hadn't become a thief out of nowhere. He'd built an entire identity on the fear that hard, honest, slow progress, the only kind I had ever actually offered him, would never be enough to prove he mattered. He chose theft instead of patience, and comfort instead of honesty. And somewhere along the way, he stopped being able to tell the difference between the two. "Do you want me to call this in?" Marcus asked. "We could have him arrested before he leaves the city." I thought about the gala, about the podium, about the version of Derek who thought he had already won. "No," I said. "Let him put on his best suit. Let him walk into that room believing he's about to inherit an empire. A man who falls from the bottom step barely notices the drop. I want him to fall from the very top, in front of everyone who ever shook his hand." The next afternoon, I met Ethan in a small diner 2 blocks from the Foundation's offices. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that's been on the burner too long. The kind of place that reminded me, more than I expected, of Sal's old stockroom. Ethan looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes. His hands wrapped so tightly around his coffee mug his knuckles had gone pale. I did not soften what I told him. I laid the truth out flat on the table between us, the way you'd lay out a map. I told him his father had embezzled $4 million from people who trusted him. I told him the desperate call for reconciliation had nothing to do with love and everything to do with using a billionaire father as a human shield against federal prison. And then I told him about the folder on my kitchen counter, 3 days after his grandmother's funeral, about the deed hidden on the last page, about $150 in crumpled bills, and a note that told a grieving man to figure it out on his own. "How could they do that?" Ethan whispered, more to himself than to me. "How do you lie to your own kid for 15 years and just live like nothing happened?" I told him lying was the easiest thing his parents had ever done, because they'd had a decade and a half of practice, and no one around to check the story against the facts. I asked him to picture a 57-year-old man walking home from a cemetery, keys that no longer fit his own front door, an empty living room where a life used to be. I told him about sleeping in a truck behind a hardware store, about a man named Sal who never asked what I could offer him before deciding I was worth helping. Ethan sat with that for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had gone hollow. "They let me believe you were the monster," he said. "My whole life, I thought you were the one who left." Ethan put his face in his hands and did not speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, and he asked me the only question that mattered. What do you need me to do? I slid a small silver flash drive across the table, the way documents had been slid across tables in this family for 15 years. Except this time the truth was inside it instead of a trap. I told him that at the gala, right before I took the stage, he needed to walk toward a man in a dark gray suit standing near the service doors and hand it to him without a word. I told him that for his entire life, his parents had made every choice for him, what to believe, who to trust, what kind of family he thought he had. Tonight, for the first time, the choice was entirely his. He took the drive, closed his fist around it, and nodded once. Before he left the booth, he asked me one more question, quiet enough that I almost missed it over the clatter of the diner. Are you scared? He asked. Doing this in front of everyone? I told him the truth. I had spent 15 years terrified of nothing at all, because I had already survived the single worst thing anyone could ever do to me, and everything after that had simply been building. Fear, I told him, only has power over what you still stand to lose. I had already lost the only things that ever truly frightened me to lose, and I had rebuilt every one of them on my own terms. The line had been drawn, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt something close to hope. The Kessler Foundation Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Ridgemont Hotel with crystal light and a wall of camera flashes along the red carpet outside. I watched from the second-floor mezzanine as Derek and Vanessa arrived like royalty, dressed in clothes purchased on a corporate credit line that had been flagged for fraud 4 separate times that week alone. A local reporter shoved a microphone toward Derek, asking about his sudden reappearance in his father's life, and he answered with a performance so smooth it almost impressed me, calling himself the dutiful son stepping up to relieve his aging father of the burden of leadership. He's given so much to this world, Derek told the cameras. One arm wrapped around Vanessa's waist, his voice pitched perfectly into that warm, wounded register he'd clearly practiced in the car. It's getting to be a lot for a man his age to carry alone. I'm just here to help him finally rest. Vanessa nodded along beside him, a hand pressed to her chest, playing the devoted daughter-in-law so convincingly that for a moment even I almost admired the craftsmanship of the lie. This was the same man who had forged a deed transfer while I stood in a cemetery 3 days earlier. The same man currently being hunted by federal investigators for stealing $4 million from people who trusted him. He was building himself a pedestal in real time on live camera, and I let him keep building because I wanted every single brick of it visible when it came down. A sharp-eyed financial reporter spotted me on the mezzanine and called up, asking whether I intended to name my successor tonight. The whole floor of the ballroom turned to look at once, Derek's eyes finding mine across the crowd, his composure flickering with something close to real hunger. I leaned on the marble railing and let the silence stretch just long enough to feel dangerous. Tonight is about legacy, I told them, my voice carrying easily over the hush that had fallen across the room. Everything I've built will go to exactly who deserves it. Derek's shoulders relaxed. He heard exactly what he wanted to hear. He had no idea the curtain was about to rise on the last performance he would ever give as a free man. I let him have that moment. I wanted him to feel the full, intoxicating weight of it, because a man who has never tasted real power has no idea how much it costs to lose. The velvet curtains parted, and I walked out onto the main stage to a wall of applause that had no idea what it was about to witness. I let the room settle into silence before I spoke, and when I did, my voice carried to every corner of that ballroom without needing to be raised. 15 years ago, I began, I stood on an empty driveway with exactly $150 to my name, no house, no family, and no idea how I was going to survive the week. I built everything you see around you out of that single afternoon. Down in the front row, Derek nodded along, still certain this was the overture to his coronation. He had unbuttoned his jacket. He was already rehearsing his acceptance face. Tonight, I continued, I'm announcing the final and irrevocable disposition of my entire estate. Effective immediately, 100% of my company's equity, my personal holdings, and every asset I own is being transferred into a new foundation. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt like the whole room had stopped breathing. I'm calling it the last page trust. Derek's smile flickered, then froze. 15 years ago, I said, I learned to always read the last page first because the people who want to hurt you count on you never getting there. This foundation exists to make sure no elderly person in this country ever has to sign away their life to someone they love without reading every single word first. It funds legal defense for victims of family financial abuse. It hunts down and prosecutes the sons and daughters who steal from the very parents who raised them. There are no heirs to this fortune. Not $1 of it will ever go to my bloodline. The gasp that went through that ballroom was audible from the balcony. Derek's face drained white, then flushed a furious red as the magnitude of what he'd just lost in front of the entire financial press caught up to him. He lunged toward the velvet rope separating the crowd from the stage, screaming that I was senile, that I had no right to strip away what belonged to him. I did not raise my voice to match his. I simply lifted a small remote from my jacket pocket and pressed a single button. The screen behind me flickered to life, 30 feet tall, showing a photograph of a crumpled $100 bill, a 50, and a note in handwriting the whole room could read clearly. You'll figure it out. This is the inheritance my son left me, I told them. 3 days after I buried my wife, while I was too numb with grief to notice him sliding a forged deed transfer into a stack of hospital paperwork. I trusted him, signed. 9 days later, I came home to an empty house and changed locks, and this note on my porch. The room that had been shocked into silence now erupted into open disgust. Reporters spun their cameras away from the podium and aimed them directly at Derek, who staggered backward under the barrage of flashes like a man being physically struck. Vanessa ripped a microphone out of a stunned reporter's hands and screamed that I was lying, that I was the one who abandoned them, spinning a story so brittle it fell apart the moment it left her mouth because nobody in that room believed a word of it anymore. That was when the service doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open and Ethan walked down the center aisle with his shoulders squared and his jaw set. He climbed over the velvet rope, took the microphone directly out of his mother's shaking hands, and told her, in front of everyone, to stop. He turned to face the crowd of investors, journalists, and stunned board members, and he told them the truth without flinching. He told them his parents had spent 15 years, telling him his grandfather was a coward who abandoned them. He told them what he'd learned in the last 48 hours, that his father had forged a signature to steal a grieving widower's house, that his father was currently under federal investigation for embezzling $4 million from his own investors, and that they had not come to this gala to celebrate anything. They had come to use a 72-year-old man as a shield against a prison sentence. Derek's control snapped entirely. He shoved past the velvet rope and charged the stage with his fist already raised, and every instinct in my body, 72 years old or not, moved before I had time to think about it. I stepped directly into his path and drove both hands into his chest, and the momentum of his own rage sent him stumbling backward into the arms of hotel security, who pinned him to the hardwood floor as he screamed and thrashed beneath them. Marcus walked out from the wings without hurrying, the same unhurried pace he always used when he already knew he'd won, and dropped a thick file of forensic evidence onto the stage beside Derek's face, reading the findings aloud into a microphone for every camera in the room to capture. $4 million embezzled. Falsified vendor invoices. A federal investigation already 6 weeks deep. Investors who had been shaking Derek's hand an hour earlier pulled out their phones on the spot, calling their own attorneys to sever ties before the scandal could touch their names too. By the time the sirens outside grew loud enough to hear through the ballroom's heavy glass windows, there was nothing left of Derek's carefully built reputation to salvage. 4 agents in dark gray suits walked through the parted crowd and up onto the stage, and I recognized every one of them because they were the exact men Ethan had handed that flash drive to less than an hour earlier. They read Derek his rights over the speaker system while he was still pinned to the floor, and Vanessa, realizing her own freedom was evaporating in real time, crawled to the edge of the stage and grabbed my pant leg, begging me to make it stop, calling me family in the same breath she had helped rob me blind 15 years ago. I looked down at her and said only 6 words. "You will figure it out." The exact phrase from the note. She collapsed against the velvet rope as the agents cuffed her husband and led him away, and Derek, in one final act of desperation, turned on his own wife and screamed at the agents to arrest her too, insisting she had orchestrated the whole scheme from the beginning, that she was the one who'd told him to forge the deed transfer 15 years ago in the first place. Vanessa screamed right back, calling him a coward and a liar, telling the room he'd blown their savings on failed side investments and hidden debts she'd only discovered by accident. The marriage they'd spent an entire evening performing for cameras came apart, in real time, in public, each of them handing the federal agents exactly the evidence they needed against the other. Two people so desperate to survive that they were willing to drown each other to buy themselves an extra month. The ballroom doors closed behind them, and the chaos drained out of the room like water from a tub. I stood alone on that stage for a long moment, looking out over the wreckage of my son's ambition, and felt nothing close to triumph. Just a long, quiet exhale, 15 years overdue. I found Ethan later on the marble staircase outside the ballroom, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, sobbing in a way that had nothing to do with performance. An hour earlier, he had been the presumed heir to a real estate fortune. Now he was the son of 2 convicted felons with a mountain of debt his father had quietly taken out in his name. I did not sit down beside him and promise to fix it. I had learned the hard way exactly what that kind of rescue does to a person. I took a push broom from a nervous hotel janitor standing nearby, walked it over, and let it fall against the marble step beside Ethan's shoes. "You did something very brave tonight," I told him. "But crying on this floor won't pay off your tuition, and it won't rebuild what your parents broke. Pick up the broom. Honest work clears the head faster than anything else I know." He looked at that broom for a long time. Then he wiped his face, picked it up, and started sweeping. It was the first thing his parents' money had never touched, and it was, in its own small way, the beginning of everything that came after. The morning after the gala, before any of the legal proceedings even began, I sat on the porch of my modest house outside the city, the one I actually live in, with a mug of black coffee, waiting for Ethan to arrive by taxi. He'd spent the entire night sweeping wreckage out of a hotel ballroom, and when he climbed my porch steps, he looked less like the boy who'd cried on marble stairs the night before, and more like a young man who had just crossed some invisible line into adulthood. He apologized for every comfortable year he'd lived on stolen money without asking questions. I told him an apology is a fine place to start, but character is built entirely by what a man does afterward. Then I handed him a manila folder, a legally binding agreement drafted by Marcus that morning, tuition paid directly to his university, never to his own account, in exchange for 20 hours a week, filing paperwork at the foundation, and earning every other dollar he needed the honest way. He read every page of it, including the last one, and signed without hesitation. I have never been prouder of anything in my life than watching him read that contract all the way through before putting his name on it. 6 months later, a federal jury found both Derek and Vanessa guilty on every charge. The trial itself moved faster than anyone expected, because the paper trail was simply too complete to argue with. I sat on the witness stand for 2 hours, walking the courtroom through the timeline in the same flat, steady voice I'd used my entire career negotiating contracts, describing the folder on my kitchen table. 3 days after Eleanor's funeral, the locks changed. 9 days later, the $150 and the note. The defense attorney tried twice to paint me as a bitter old man exacting a grudge. Both times, the forensic handwriting analysis on the original deed transfer, matched against samples of Derek's writing from that exact period, did more damage to his case than anything I said ever could. 12 jurors sat through it, and I watched several of them visibly recoil when the prosecutor laid the 15-year-old forgery next to the $4 million embezzlement scheme and let the pattern speak for itself. The forged deed transfer from 15 years ago surfaced in court alongside the embezzlement evidence, painting a portrait of a man who had been stealing from the people who trusted him his entire adult life. The judge sentenced them each to 15 years, 1 year for every year I had spent rebuilding a life they thought they had destroyed for good. I visited Derek once at the federal facility, months into his sentence. He looked smaller behind the glass than I remembered, his hair thinner, his posture folded in on itself. He apologized, and for a moment I almost believed him, until the apology curdled into a request for money for his commissary account, because even behind bars, even after losing everything, his first instinct was still to ask me for a handout. I reached into my jacket and slid 2 bills through the slot in the glass. $100. $50. He stared at the money, confused, until I told him exactly why. "That's what you left me," I said. "That's exactly what you left me." I watched the realization land on him like a physical weight, and I hung up the phone and walked out without looking back. Ethan finished his degree 2 years later, still holding down those 20 hours a week at the Last Page Trust, still paying his own rent and his own groceries out of an honest paycheck, exactly as we'd agreed that morning on my porch. He had not asked me for a single dollar in cash since the day he signed that contract. And I want to be clear about what that actually meant, because I know plenty of people who would call that cruelty rather than love. It was the hardest thing I ever did as a grandfather, watching a boy I could have rescued with a single phone call, instead learn to rescue himself, one shift, one paycheck, one hard month at a time. But I had already watched what happens when you hand a young person an empire before they've learned what it costs to build one, and I was not to make that mistake twice with the only piece of my family I had left. I sat in the front row of his graduation in a plain carcoal suit, no entourage, no press, just an old man watching his grandson's name get called. Sal came too, 81 years old by then. In a bolo tie he swore he'd been saving for a special occasion since 1987, and when the dean announced Ethan as valedictorian, Sal gripped my arm so hard I nearly lost feeling in it. Ethan walked to that podium and did not mention his parents by name, did not dwell on the scandal that had followed his family through every local paper for 2 years running. Instead, he talked about the difference between being rescued and being taught to survive. He said the most important lesson of his life had not come from any classroom, but from a push broom dropped at his feet on the worst night of his life, and 150 crumpled dollars handed to a man 15 years earlier. Under circumstances no child should ever have to learn about their own parents. He said the man who actually saved him did it by refusing to save him the easy way, by drawing a line and daring him to cross it on his own 2 feet. Then he looked straight at me in the front row and said, the man who taught him the value of an honest dollar and the price of his own self-respect was his grandfather. The stadium came apart with applause, and I sat there with Sal's hand still on my arm, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in 15 years, a peace that had nothing left to prove. Ethan works at the Last Page Trust full-time now, no longer as the clerk filing paperwork for $20 an hour, but as the director of our Elder Fraud Rapid Response Unit, the team that gets a call within hours whenever a family member tries to pull exactly the trick that was pulled on me. Last year alone, that unit intervened in over 3,000 cases across the country, freezing illegal asset transfers, reversing forged powers of attorney, putting dozens of predatory relatives behind bars before they could finish what they started. One case file that still sits on my desk involves a 71-year-old widow in Ohio whose daughter had already changed the locks on her own front door, exactly the way mine were changed, and our legal team got there in time. She is sleeping in her own bed tonight because $150 once taught an old man to build something that could catch the next family before they finished the job. I still keep a small display case in the lobby of the Last Page Trust, the original 100, the 50, the yellowed note that once told a grieving man to figure it out on his own, and beside it, the very last page of a document I once nearly signed without reading, the page that taught me the habit that eventually saved everything I had left to save. Thousands of people walk past that case every year on their way in to file a case or ask for help, and most of them stop, just for a moment, to read the handwriting. I sit by a quiet lake most evenings now, phone silent on the dock beside me, Fishing line out in the water, Sal's old radio playing low from the porch of the little cabin I built out here 2 summers ago. I think more often than you might expect about the distance between the man who once sat on his own front porch steps with $150 and nothing else, and the man who sits here now with more peace than he ever imagined possible at 57. I did not get here by seeking revenge. I got here by refusing ever again to sign my name to anything or trust my heart to anyone without reading every single word first. Family is not something blood guarantees you. It is something you build carefully with people who have actually earned the right to stand beside you. The way Sal stood beside me in a hardware store stockroom when I had nothing left to offer him but honest labor. The way Ethan stood beside me on a stage in front of the whole world and chose the truth over comfort. If someone shows you exactly who they are at the lowest moment of your life, believe them the first time. Grieve what you have to grieve. And then, always, without exception, read it all the way to the very last page. If you believe respect has to be earned, and never simply handed over because of blood, tell me where you're watching from tonight in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and I will see you in the next one.